Where Are the Grown-Ups? The title of her book. She brought it out about a year ago.
Yes, almost a year.
And there's some Dutch and some Anglo interest there. So let's enjoy it. I'll pass you over to Ruth. All yours.
Thank you very much. And hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. And I hope you find this interesting. As Bernard said, my name's Ruth Badley. I'm a journalist and a freelance writer, and I have a background in performing arts and education. And I published my first book, a project that took me 2 years to complete. It's called Where Are the Grown-Ups? And it's a family memoir, which explores parent and child relationships through 3 generations of my Dutch Jewish family tree. It's memoir, so it is about me, my mother Sylvia, and the grandmother I didn't know, whose name was Rose. Some parts are written as my own lived experience, and in other parts I used research from a genealogist like yourself. In addition, I examined historical records and archives, and I could also refer to a brief journal that my mother wrote about her upbringing. So my purpose in writing the book was really to reflect on the impact of a hidden tragedy within my family that affected us all. And this was Rose's death at the age of 25, which was never spoken about in my family. Today's lived experience is tomorrow's genealogical research. So I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to speak to you today, because I really want to pay tribute very sincerely to the valuable and painstaking work many of you do to uncover the details that give people the answers they're seeking about themselves and where they came from. I strongly believe that we can learn more about ourselves by understanding the people that came before us. But I wonder if you always know what people do with the information you provide, or what difference it makes to them. I hope by the end of my talk to provide you with some answers to that, because in my own case, the impact has been profound. My story is told in 3 parts, and I don't tell it in a straight line. The story unfolds gradually by going back and forth in time. And I'd like to explain a little about the background to the book and talk about the challenges of turning genealogical research into a compelling narrative. And I'm also going to read you an extract to give you a flavour of what I did with the information. So I started writing Where Are the Grown-Ups in 2015, soon after my mother Sylvia died. My writing really started as a response to grief. I was living overseas when she was taken ill, and she was admitted to hospital, and I flew home to be at her bedside. I was with her for the week preceding her death and at the moment of her death, and I found writing was a helpful way to process the experience. The key point about all this is that for very many years, we hadn't had a very good relationship at all. It was unsatisfactory for both of us. And yet when she was in hospital and unable to communicate in conventional ways, something significant passed between us that had eluded us in all the preceding years. So in the writing, I was trying to unravel what had gone wrong. And really, there was something fundamental missing in my mother's childhood, and this had affected her deeply. We all knew she'd been adopted as a tiny baby by a childless great aunt and uncle because her mother had died. She knew next to nothing about her mother, and this missing part of her history and mine was thrown into sharp relief when I found some photographs amongst her personal effects that I'd never seen before. And that really set me on a path to find out more about Rose and what happened to her. 2 of the photographs I found are reproduced on the cover of my book. And I'll show you this here. On the front cover, if everyone can see that, is a picture of a little girl. This is actually my mother. On the back of that photograph was a date. So I knew that she was 3 years old at the time this photograph was taken. And then another photograph reproduced on the back of the book, which some of you may have seen on the Facebook post advertising this talk, is a picture of my maternal grandparents, Ruben de Haan and Rose Wagenhusen. Good Dutch names there, and they're pictured on their wedding day. So I'm going to tell you quite a bit about them in the course of the talk. So Ruben de Haan and Rose Wagenhusen, that were pictured on their wedding day, which was the 21st of July, 1929. And they were both born in East London, but they came from Dutch immigrant backgrounds. Rose's father, Hyman Wagenhusen, was a cigar maker from Amsterdam, and he later changed his name to Harry Wagner. It's a lot easier to pronounce. Ruben was illegitimate and was brought up by his grandmother. His deceased grandfather, Samuel de Haan, was said to be a cigar maker on the 1911 census, but later documents list him as a tailor, and he was also from Amsterdam. Some years before my mother died, a friend with an interest in genealogy had done some work on my family tree. So I turned to her for some help in obtaining some documents, or copies of documents really, that might provide some answers to some of the outstanding questions I had. And the most pressing of these was what had caused Rose to die. The only explanation that had been passed down to me was that she had died in childbirth. It's a very vague phrase, isn't it? In childbirth. What does it mean exactly? What was it exactly that killed her? I know genealogical research is much, much more than birth, marriage, and death certificates, but I can tell you that in my case, copies of those documents gave me the emotional route straight to the heart of my story and a strong foundation on which I could build. And until I saw the information those documents contained, I wasn't certain I even had a story that would make a book. So what did I learn that was new? Well, the date of marriage and the date of death. This was shocking. Rose and Ruben were only married for 10 months. On your wedding day, you hope and you expect many happy years together, but it was not to be for this couple. Ruben was only 24 years old when he became a new father and a widower in the same week. I've 2 grown-up sons myself, and there was something about that fact that broke my heart. It's such an achingly young age to cope with 2 such life-changing events. Rose was 25 when she died, and she died of a specific condition, postpartum eclampsia, a condition that causes a dangerous rise in blood pressure, and it can lead to fits and organ failure and death. She died 3 days after giving birth to a daughter, my mother, so not in childbirth, as the story was handed down. On a much lighter note, this might make some of you smile, I also had confirmation that my mother Sylvia lied about her age. We always knew that she took 5 years off. In fact, she left specific instructions in her will that her headstone was to say she was born in 1935. Untrue. She was born in 1930. My brother and I granted this request in her will, but I know she'd be furious that I've uncovered the truth in my book. Rose gave birth at home, and that was 15 Copley Street in Stepney Green. But her death certificate states that she died in hospital at St Mary's in Paddington, a very long way from the East End, and this finding remains controversial. Her condition and her symptoms must have been recognised as an emergency. So why was she taken to a hospital so far away? And whether the journey across London contributed to her death, we'll never know. And I'm going to expand on this point a bit later. Rose was employed as a cigarette maker at the time of her marriage, and Reuben was said to be a racecourse tipster. Intriguingly, Reuben is said to be a boot salesman at the time of his wife's death, just a few months later. Why was this? What had caused the change? As a writer, and knowing something about Reuben's background and personality, I sought to find a plausible explanation for this in the story, which would say something to readers about his character. In short, when I looked at the documents, the copies of the marriage and death certificate, Rose and Reuben became much more real to me as people, which as a writer is extremely helpful. The humanity and the tragedy of my ancestors' lives was really revealed to me for the first time, and that's what inspired me to communicate the story to a wider group of readers beyond my immediate family. Of course, to make this remotely interesting to other people, I knew I would need to use the information I had to build up a fuller picture and create characters that would live and breathe in their own world. To do that, and I needed to go beyond the official documents. What I had found in them suggested the additional research I needed to do. As I mentioned, Rose was employed as a cigarette maker, and at the time of her marriage, her father was said to be a cigar maker. That to me suggested some passing of knowledge in the same industry from father to daughter. I found out that in the late 1920s, mechanisation was just being brought into cigarette factories, and I thought about this, and I concluded that new technology doesn't arrive everywhere at the same time. So I decided to make Rose a hand roller. A third-party description in my mother's journal said Rose was exceptionally sweet-natured and petite. I thought of her as having small, dexterous hands, and I put her in a factory where these artisan skills were in danger of disappearing. A historian told me that aside from the bigger companies like Godfrey Phillips, there were a handful of smaller enterprises manufacturing bespoke cigarettes in the East End. So that was where I placed Rose in my story. As Rose died of a specific condition in a particular hospital, historic patient records and treatments for postpartum eclampsia might be available to me. And that was another very exciting line of research that I wanted to explore. Knowing I was going to talk to you today, I had a look back at the research file on my computer to remind me of the kind of areas I covered. And these included cigarette production, race courses, childbirth in the Jewish East End, the geography of the area associated with my relatives, the location of graves and maps showing the actual addresses where they lived. I was based in Dubai at the time that I started writing, which is probably not the best place to research life in the Jewish East End. So much of the early research was limited to the online resources I could find, of which there are plenty, but I supplemented that with what I thought were really essential research trips home. I sought expert input and advice because I'm not a genealogist or a historian myself. From my desk in Dubai, I corresponded with academics, medical historians, hospital archivists, synagogue administrators, midwives, and when I came back to London, I took a one-to-one walking tour with a very eminent blue badge guide that many of you will know, the very knowledgeable Rachel Kolsky. So before I read an extract from the book, I'd like to give you some background to Reuben and Rose as a couple. As I've said, at the time of his marriage, Reuben was 23 years old and he'd had an unfortunate start in life. As mentioned before, he was illegitimate, which is a terrible stigma for both the child and the unmarried mother in the early years of the 20th century, and I imagine especially in the Jewish community. Such was the shame that his mother abandoned him completely, and it was left to his grandmother Elizabeth to bring him up as her child. Now, Elizabeth had 9 children of her own, and she already had a son called Reuben. So to avoid confusion, and because he was the youngest, She called him boy as a term of affection, and that's how he was known throughout his life. As I subsequently found out, he was only Reuben on the official documents. He was treated as a younger brother by Elizabeth's children, but in reality, they were his aunts and uncles. Boy's birth mother, Miriam, eventually married and had more children, but she refused to acknowledge her firstborn son, and this rejection left a deep scar. He is not mentioned by name on Miriam's gravestone, though all her other children are named. Now, Boy was articulate and street smart, but he had no interest in school, and he left without a report from his headmaster, which was a barrier to getting a job. He took to hanging around the illegal gambling clubs and billiard halls in the area, and soon he was running errands for some of the shady characters that ran them. He could have been recruited into an East End criminal gang, but luckily, a new form of popular entertainment presented an opportunity. Greyhound racing had come to London, and everyone was going to the dogs. Boy got himself a job at a new track at West Ham, and he became a tic-tac man, signalling the odds. And around this time, he met Rose. She was a year older than him, and her background was uncomplicated and conventional compared to Boy's. She had an older married sister, and I can tell you a little bit more about her later. She had a mother, a father. There were no skeletons in the cupboard. To me, she seemed like a glass half full person, hopeful and optimistic. And they both saw the good in each other and fell in love. Knowing the culture of Jewish families, I suspect Boy's aunts and uncles must have breathed a sigh of relief that he was settling down with a nice girl. Her family probably had some misgivings, but the marriage went ahead with their blessing. During the writing, I would sometimes come across a fact that immediately suggested a scene in my mind. I mentioned that my mother wrote a very brief account of her background, and in it she says a relative who was present remembered that after her mother died, all the family met to decide what was to be done about the baby, which was her. She was told that her father arrived at 15 Copley Street, Stepney Green, a tiny house where all the family had gathered to discuss the situation. She was told he came in holding his newborn baby in his arms and laid her down on an old battered sofa while the adults decided on a solution. So I'm going to read you an extract now, which really covers the events that I've just spoken about, and then I'll give you a little bit more information at the end of that. Boy stood on the hospital steps, paralysed by grief, his baby daughter in his arms, and a death certificate in his pocket. Feelings that took him right back to the jeers and disgraces of childhood had surfaced anew. All those years when he'd felt bewildered, angry, and abandoned, it was Elizabeth's devotion that had saved him. Then he met Rose. Now she was gone, and nothing about his world made sense anymore. Weeping, he looked at the sleeping baby, but the tears he shed were for himself and the happiness that had been snatched away from him so cruelly. How had it come to this? They hadn't even celebrated their first wedding anniversary. The responsibility of being the sole provider of care and protection to this helpless creature was overwhelming. What was he supposed to do with a baby and no wife? He'd said as much to the doctor. Much of the medical explanation had gone over his head. Not understanding the words made it harder to accept. They'd asked for his occupation to fill in the details on the death certificate, and he couldn't bring himself to say he was a racecourse tipster. Boot salesman sounded more respectable, and it was sort of half true if he counted helping old Harry out in the market. The broken faces, the sobbing of his aunts and uncles, his in-laws and her beloved sister would haunt him forevermore. Postpartum eclampsia, the death certificate said. Something to do with high blood pressure after the birth. Caused a seizure. None of it mattered now. Something the nurse said kept playing back in his mind, though. She's a little small, but she's a miracle and such a comfort in your terrible loss. He'd nodded absently at the time. He'd always thought doctors could choose whose life was saved. A distant clock struck the hour, and he realised he was still trying to process the events of the last few days from the hospital steps. He stared down at the tiny form that had brought such joy only 3 days earlier. Now he looked at her with coldness in his heart. "Why her and not you?" he hissed, and then he wept again at his callousness. His own mother must have resented his birth too, and now history had come full circle. Someone else would have to rescue this baby, as he had been rescued. He stepped purposefully down the steps and headed for home. It was a short walk back from the hospital on Whitechapel Road to Copley Street, and Boy kept his eyes fixed ahead. He wouldn't think about the countless times they'd walked and embraced on this street. The shopkeepers going about their daily routines stopped, took off their caps, and bowed their heads as he walked by. A group of chattering women on the corner fell silent as he approached. At the sight of him carrying his baby, one covered her face with her hands and wept loudly. Like a prayer, they murmured as one the Jewish line of comfort to the bereaved, "Wishing you long life." From another, "God bless. Such a tragedy." He didn't acknowledge them. After the funeral, and in view of the circumstances, there would be 7 days of ritual observance for prayers and comfort. Seated on low stools, he would receive their condolences then, alongside Rose's immediate family. He feared breaking down if he stopped to explain, but then a little girl with jam round her mouth stood in his path, questions on her lips. "Is that your baby, mister? Can I have a look?" "Not now, dear," he said, sidestepping the child and quickening his pace. "Why, is her mummy going to feed her?" she called to his retreating back. He reached the house and let himself in. When he opened the door to the rarely used front parlour, the aunts and uncles all rose to their feet, shock etched on their faces. The men unshaven, hollow-eyed, the women pale and unkempt. No one spoke. They watched in silence as Boy gently lay the sleeping baby down on the old sofa. In position, they formed a grotesque tableau, every eye trained on the tiny swaddled shape. They discussed a solution just before he arrived. The unmarried aunts dabbed at their eyes, knowing they could offer little. Those that had families of their own were already struggling. Money was tight, and they could do without another mouth to feed. There was only one sensible way forward, and they hoped Boy would agree to it. Finally, he broke the silence. "I don't know what to do," he said, waving his hands towards the baby in despair. They moved in a protective circle around him. Only Becky and her husband Jack stayed in their places, staring down at the baby in awe. They'd been married for some years, but had no children of their own. Becky could always be relied on to feed and care for the children in the family when required, but she saw something different in this baby than in the others she'd looked after. This one could be hers, and hers alone, a precious possession to keep, protect, and shield from the whole world. "We'll help you, Boy," she said without looking up. "We'll take care of her. She won't want for anything. We'll make sure of that, the little darling." "She's so beautiful," said Jack, his voice wavering. "Would you let us bring her up?" To him, this baby was a perfect being, one he could shower with love and all the material things he could afford. She would be his pride and joy, and the friend he would have for the rest of his life. One of the uncles chimed in. "What do you say, Boy? It's the best way, don't you think?" Everyone held their breath, waiting for his response, trying to read his face. The baby let out a little cry in her sleep. "Thank you, Becky and Jack," he said at last. "I don't know how I will ever thank you enough, but I'll pay for everything you need to look after her, and more. On my life, I swear I won't let her be a burden to you, Becky, I promise." Some of the aunts and uncles exchanged relieved looks. The baby began to cry. Becky lifted her from the sofa and held her close. When Boy saw his daughter in the arms of another, he knew something was being taken from him that was rightfully his. Becky knew it too. She didn't trust Boy, and she didn't want his promises. With promises came interference and the possibility that one day he might change his mind and take the baby away from her. Or worse still, when the child grew up, she would want to be with her own father. Jack knew that if the child loved him, she wouldn't want to leave him. But nevertheless, a bargain was struck to safeguard everyone's interests. Becky and Jack would bring the baby up as their own, but out of respect to her father, she would keep his surname. Sylvia was the name she'd been given, but within the family, she would also be known as Rose, in memory of her mother. Boy would have access to his daughter whenever he wanted, but an official adoption should take place as soon as possible. It was settled. Becky and Jack had a child of their own at last. Boy slipped out of the parlour and opened the door to the bedroom he and Rose had shared. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside for the last time. The bed was unmade as they'd left it after the ambulance arrived. The dent in the pillow where she'd last laid her aching head was still visible. He bent to touch it tenderly, and as he did, something caught his eye. A gold wedding band in a little dish on the table by the bed. She'd taken it off when her fingers started to swell. There was another ring there too, set with a tiny emerald. Her mother had given it to her on their wedding day. Perhaps he should ask Becky to keep it safe for now, so the baby could have something from her mother when she was older. His hand hovered over the dish as if he was torn. He'd get a good price for 2 rings if he touted them around the jewellers he knew in Black Lion Yard. Finally, he picked up both rings, slipped them in his pocket, and left the house without a word. There was a funeral to pay for. When I came to write that scene, I had to think about where Boy had come from before he arrived at the house, and I decided he came straight from the hospital with a death certificate in his pocket. In the extract I just read, Boy walks home from the hospital in Whitechapel Road through the streets of Stepney Green. This is entirely possible, but in reality, it couldn't have happened because, as I have said, the actual hospital where Rose died was in Paddington, too far away to walk. I don't think it's important that I deviated from the exact facts, because in writing that scene, I wanted to convey the terrible sadness of his situation and his helplessness, and also I wanted to reflect the support he would have felt from his community. There are aspects of my story where I used my imagination because a definitive answer couldn't be found. I knew the outcomes and the attitudes of some of the people involved, and what was important to me was to recreate the emotional truth of the various family challenges I described. The genealogists that helped, I can't really say that word, can I? Genealogists that helped me unearth the information about my family found out that when she was a child, Rose's family made several third-class trips to Canada by steamship. I believe this would have been to see relatives on her mother's side. Passenger lists and the Canadian census of 1911 shows the whole family had changed their name to Wagner, and Hyman had become Harry by that point. This was before the First World War, and the steamships all belonged to the White Star Line. One journey was actually made 2 years before the sinking of the Titanic in 1912. And it occurred to me that it was a simple twist of fate that Rose wasn't on that ship And I wanted to include that because I thought readers might also make that connection with the White Star Line. So I wrote a scene where Boy points this out and shows how he fears for her safety. And his fears for Rose come true, of course, but in a different way. It also occurred to me that in a time of great emigration to America and Canada, it was peculiar that none of my ancestors stayed. They all had a go, but they all returned to the East End. Reuben's grandmother Elizabeth and her husband Samuel travelled to America as a young couple, and several of their elder children were born in America. They all returned to the East End. I don't know this, but I expect they realised they were no better off in America, and possibly work might have dried up for Samuel, who was a tailor by this point. On one trip, Rose's family remained in Canada for 2 years. If they'd stayed permanently, she wouldn't have met Reuben and probably died in the way that she did, but then I wouldn't be here now either, talking to you. In the course of writing the book, I visited Sandys Row Synagogue, Marlow Road Cemetery many times, and many of the locations and addresses associated with my family history. I also spent time at Tower Hamlets Local History and Archive, looking at newspapers and photographs in their collection. And I mentioned earlier being very excited about the prospect of contacting St Mary's Hospital, Paddington. So when the archivist at St Mary's told me that no historical patient records remained for 1930, I was initially quite disappointed. But this actually turned out for the best in the end, as I'll go on to explain. Instead, I was very fortunate to be able to consult obstetric patient records from 1930 at the archive of Bart's NHS Trust. And I wanted to do this in order to understand the kind of treatments and outcomes for women with the same condition as my grandmother. This is the same archive that researchers on Call the Midwife use, and it's essentially the obstetric records from the London Hospital in Whitechapel. And I remember asking on one trip, I remember asking the archivist why some entries were written in red ink. And he explained to me that red ink was hospital code for a fatal outcome. And the records I looked at show that 11 women between the ages of 17 and 36 were admitted to the London hospital with eclampsia in 1930. The condition plays out in a dangerously raised blood pressure that can lead to fits and organ failure. And the records that I read showed that 3 women died. There was one heart-rending case when both the mother and the baby were lost. And I thought at the time that there is another book to be written about those 3 women and the events that followed their deaths. Reading the details, it was then that I was really grateful that there were no patient records available at St Mary's. And I'd been spared seeing my grandmother's name on a list of fatalities. I think that would have been very, very hard. Eclampsia was a condition that was well understood, but the drugs were less effective than they are today. It's still a condition that can kill new mothers today, but of course we're very good at monitoring and recognizing the symptoms, and we have much more effective treatments. In 1930, some women responded to drug treatment and others didn't. I corresponded with Dr. Lara Marks, who's written extensively on historic East End maternity care amongst the Jewish population in particular. And her research shows it was better than in many parts of the country, but tragedies, of course, still occurred. Eclampsia is a dangerous condition, and most midwives and doctors are very alert to looking out for it today. If the pregnancy is well advanced, the cure for the condition is usually to have the baby. But very occasionally, the symptoms persist after delivery, and that's what happened in my grandmother's case. As well as historical records, I read as many true accounts of life in the East End as I could. But I reached a point when the research was actually preventing me from writing the story I wanted to tell. I almost had too much information, and it was leading me in too many different and interesting directions. I have details of my ancestors going back to the 1880s in Amsterdam, but it was very clear to me that my story needed to focus on specific people covering 3 generations, and I had to stick to that, or the story I wanted to tell would be diluted. There's also a danger with historical research that it becomes the story in itself. It has to serve the story. Otherwise, the author is just saying, look at me and how much research I've done and how clever I am. And it becomes very dull to read. So I only tried to include details of time and place that push the story forward, and to use them with a light touch, really. One of the best things I did was to live in the same area as my ancestors. I realised I was very lucky to do that. For 6 months, I lived a short walk where many of the events in the book took place. I really can't explain this, but it was very powerful and meaningful to walk in my ancestors' footsteps. There's a chapter at the end of the book where I go into more detail about that. And I visit Stepney Green and the East End area often still. I was there last week, and I probably always will. Inheritance is a theme running through the book, because when I started putting this story together, I found a recurring pattern of human behaviour rippling through the generations, and it made me think about what we inherit from our ancestors. The material things that have meaning for us, perhaps, but also skills, talents, perhaps also our weaknesses, our flaws, and maybe our mistakes. Where Are the Grown-Ups has a cast of characters that often unwittingly repeat the mistakes of the past. And these include assertive and controlling women, a succession of weak men, a couple of heroic husbands, and 2 monstrous stepmothers. As we all have challenging family relationships from time to time, I hope that some of the situations I described would help readers identify with the characters, and perhaps it would remind them of something similar in their own families. So what has the genealogical research and writing all this down done for me? It's helped me make peace with the past and given my grandmother a longer life in print than she was allowed on earth. In the course of the writing, I spent many hours in Marlow Road Cemetery in East Ham at her graveside, reading the many words on her stone, and incidentally spotting a spelling mistake, which obviously can't be corrected in stone. She was a humble cigarette maker from Stepney Green. She didn't change the world at large, but her death left a huge absence in my mother's life and my own. And I think in writing the book, I've come to understand my mother a little more. I wasn't always so generous and understanding with her in her lifetime, but I feel I understand her a bit more now. There's a poem on Rose's stone that promises she won't be forgotten. And as her granddaughter, I'm proud to have done something to ensure her story reaches many other people, both here and across the world, yourselves included. In conclusion, I wrote an article for the Jewish Chronicle on this story, and I understand Lee will make that available to members on the Jewish Geological website. It was published last month, and when it appeared in the Jewish Chronicle, it was a very emotional moment for me, and an acknowledgement that writing family history down is so important and of value well beyond the writer themselves. And I said I was going to mention something about Rose's sister, because since the article in the Jewish Chronicle appeared, I've been contacted by a relative who lived through many of the events I described. I mentioned earlier that Rose had an older sister. She was called Esther, but she was known as Hetty in her lifetime. She contracted TB 2 years after the death of Rose, very likely because of it, because they were very close, and Hetty really never got over the loss of her younger sister. Hetty's a minor character in my book, but I know that she left behind 2 little boys called Harold and Leslie. Leslie, who is now in his 90s, got in touch with me and has told me of his very sad and difficult upbringing after his own mother died. He was a small child when first his aunt Rose and then his mother died. My book has brought us together and completed the circle. So finally, for anyone interested in reading the whole book, Where Are the Grown-Ups? This is remind you of the cover again. It's available in paperback and Kindle format online at amazon.co.uk and also amazon.com. It's also available on the Book Depository, which is an online site. And the Book Depository can send paperback copies worldwide with free shipping. Signed copies are also available from me direct, and Lee can supply my email address if anyone wishes to arrange that. I'm happy for my email address to be passed on for that purpose. So thank you very much for listening. I think I've been talking for about 50 minutes, so I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have, and I hope you've enjoyed my talk.
Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you.
Everyone's on mute, which is a little bit of a strange thing, so it can be a little difficult to show applause, but if you do switch to gallery view, hopefully we can show Ruth our applause by clapping. I need to turn my video on so you can see me clapping. But yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you. I can see you all now.
Okay. So, are there any questions for Ruth? If you have them, please feel free to raise your hand in front of your face, or if you go to the participants button at the bottom, you can actually raise a little blue hand.
Something about it. Was the hand.
Just mute you, Henry. So, any questions for Ruth? I know I have one, but I'll let someone else. Gina.
Hold on. I'm trying to have two. I've tried to get two screens on here.
Oh, you just muted yourself again, Gina. You were unmuted.
Did it the wrong way around.
Yeah. Go ahead, please, Gina.
Okay, I just need to bring up the family tree again. I've done a lot of research on the Dehaan family for Rachel, who is sitting up there.
Okay.
And I just wanted to check, who was this? Did you say that Reuben remarried?
Yes.
Now, did he marry Esther Vogel, or is that
He
someone?
did. He did. He did.
Right. It's probably maybe better if I email you direct to discuss it further. But what was his father's name, did you say?
He was illegitimate.
So you don't know his father?
Unknown.
No. Okay.
Unknown.
Well, I need to tie up two people on here, because I've actually put that the father of Reuben, who married Esther Vogel, was a Samuel.
Well, that's his grandfather. That's his grandfather, because he.
His grandfather.
Yes,
Right.
he was brought up by his grandmother Elizabeth. His birth father is unknown.
Right.
Or
Okay.
anonymous.
And his mother?
His mother was called Miriam. His birth mother was called Miriam.
Right. So I'm trying to operate two screens here. It's not very easy. I usually use a separate screen for my tree.
So Miriam was Elizabeth's eldest daughter.
I better email you, because it's very difficult here. I have got you on the tree here, and Sylvia and Reuben, and then I've got unnamed for them, but I will speak to you separately. I don't want to bore everybody to tears. Somebody else might have a question too. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gina. Any other questions?
How many books have you actually sold?
Who's asking?
That's from Ruth, I think, is it?
Yes.
Where's Ruth? Ruth Barina. How many books have I sold?
Yes.
Do you know? I don't know. I don't know.
Oh.
No, I haven't really counted. I do lots of events. I sell them. I get sales reports from Amazon, you know, on a monthly basis. I do events like this. I talk to all sorts of different groups, writers groups, family history societies, all book clubs, all sorts. In a way, my sales are not the overriding thing in my mind. What I enjoy doing is talking to people like you who are interested in the story for different reasons, and just communicating. I hope I've communicated my interest and passion for the subject. I spoke to a group
if you get to
Australia.
if you get to Israel, after the corona's all finished and we're all safe, I'd like to invite you to one of our meetings.
Wow, well, I'd love to take you up on that. I've never been to Israel. It's on my list. It's on my list to visit, so that is a lovely reason to come. Brilliant. Yeah, do keep in touch with me. I'll definitely love to do that. Do you think they'd like that?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Thank you both, Ruth. If we can move to Anita for the next question.
Yeah, hi. I thought it was a lovely talk. Thank you very much. Really enjoyable. Two observations or questions. You mentioned the shopkeepers all took off their caps. Were the shopkeepers meant to be Jewish or not?
Unspecified. I should imagine most of them were. There might have been a few. I know you can look at Kelly's directory to find out exactly.
It's just
who was on Whitechapel Road at that time. I just convey.
I don't think they would have taken their caps off though. Jews wouldn't have taken their caps off.
Well,
even as a model, they would have kept them on. You know, there's just an observation. They definitely.
I didn't mean couples. I meant the flat caps.
Yeah, I mean that's just, you know, that just. And the other thing which was interesting was the word the boy. Now, when I was 17, I made friends. My best friend was a girl from the East End, from a Dutch Jewish East End family. Now, the grandson, her nephew was often in the house, and the nephew was often referred to as the boy, as a term of endearment.
Yeah.
I had never actually in my life heard anybody call anybody the boy, but I don't know. I mean, I just thought when you sort of brought up that the boy was just called the boy, it just brought this memory back of another sort of Dutch family calling a very beloved nephew, grandson, the boy.
Yeah, it sounds strange to us, but it was a thing. I've heard that before.
Yeah, the boy. It's lovely.
Can I just say I know of another family who called the son boy, and that was, I mean, he's gone now as well. If he was alive, he'd be about 100, and he was called boy from birth. So there are other families, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's relevant, but I think Tarzan and Jane called their son boy as well, but that was perhaps for different reasons. Sorry.
Okay, a question, please. And thank you very much, Ruth. That was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Which shul were any of the family associated with in the East End?
I just know that they got married at Sandy's Row.
Sandy's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I must have missed that out in my notes, but
no,
they were married at Sandy's Row, which is, I visited that synagogue in the course of research, and they had a record of their marriage there.
Oh, so, yeah. But Sandy's Row's still open, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anthony. And Hazel, do you have a question? If you can unmute yourself. There we go.
2 or 3 little things, Ruth. The first was I was also amused by the boy, because I remember my grandmother calling my grandfather boy. Everyone else called him, who knew him well, not me in other words, Manny for Herman, but she called him boy. Just a couple of things that passed through my mind. I managed to, by sheer luck, through DNA, to track down the name of my great-great-grandfather, who was the father of my illegitimate great-grandmother.
Right.
Always worth a shot. The other thing that went through my mind, you said that there were no patient records in the archives of St Mary's.
Not for that time, not for that year. I don't know if other years are available, but not for that particular year.
There is a database of hospital archives and where the different kinds of records are, if they still exist. I had a fruitless search myself for a very different reason, and it meant exploring the changes of authorities over a particular pair of hospitals, because archives get sort of dumped or moved as this happens, and in our lifetimes it's happened many times. And it just struck me that it could be worth you exploring that.
Thank you for that. But I think I was told, I'm sure I haven't made this up, I'm sure I was told at some point, because I asked, why aren't the records available? There'd been a fire at some point, and a lot had been destroyed. So
that's a common story with archives.
Yeah, so kind of left there. Yeah, but thank you for that.
Thank you, Hazel. I wonder if I could ask my question now. I was just wondering about whether you and your mother were close to your adoptive grandfather, your real grandfather, or both.
Right. Well, Becky and Jack, that adopted my mother, to me, they were my grandparents. They were my papa and nana. And that's how I looked upon them. But my mother always referred to her aunt and uncle. You see what I mean? But as a child, you know, those old people were equivalent to my grandparents. So I did once question my mum when I was a child. It's actually in the book. We have a conversation about how come that my dad has a mum, but you've got an aunt and an uncle. It must have occurred to me as a child that there was something unusual about this. But that's, you know, we all understood that she was adopted, and that because her adopted parents were old, they appeared to be like grandparents to me.
And what about a relationship with Boy?
Well, I don't want to give too many spoilers.
Okay, sorry.
I mean, somebody's already mentioned that Boy married again. It was quite a swift remarriage. And let us say, I wanted to show in that extract that I read that there were sides to his character, and not always his fault. I felt a great deal of sympathy with him in that extract, but there were sides to his character that made doing the right thing and doing the wrong thing, it sometimes made it quite difficult for him to choose the right path, shall we say. And I also mentioned about repeating patterns through the generations, and child relationships, troubles between them being repeated. And let's say Boy didn't actually behave terribly well towards my mother. I met him once. I was a child, and I remember him coming to our house once. And then he did disgrace himself after that. So we didn't talk to him, and we didn't know much about him. And he went on he had 2 daughters by his second marriage, and my mother isn't mentioned on his gravestone. On his gravestone, he had 2 daughters, but I know he had 3, and my mother isn't mentioned. So that's the answer to that, probably.
You said there was a typo on one of the tombstones. I think there are ways of fixing it, but now you've done all the research and written the book, you could always add the missing people to the gravestones. I don't know if that's sacrilegious or not, but
well, I think that's a bit presumptuous of me, isn't it? They were left off for a reason, and the people went to their grave, you know, happy with that. I'd be altering history, and wouldn't I, for the future people like yourselves? I'd be altering the course of history, altering the facts. And the spelling mistake, Reuben is spelled incorrectly on the stone. The E and the U are the wrong way round, and it just made me smile, really. Mm-hmm. And I'd gone there several times, and I'd stared at this, thinking there's something wrong with that, and I can't quite work out what it is. It took about 3 goes before I realised, yeah, there's a spelling mistake.
Quite often the Hebrew is spelt correctly, and the English can always be a bit variable, and as genealogists we have to be very flexible anyway. So.
Yes, that's right.
Any other questions for Ruth? David, let me try and unmute you.
Well, I enjoyed that very, very much. It was extremely interesting.
I did too.
My wife did too. She's not visible, but she was here. My question has nothing to do with the immediate talk. It's to do with the name Dehaan.
Yes.
And I wondered if you on your tree you've got an oboist. Do you know whether you've got an oboist? I think his name was Nicholas Dehaan. This would have been in Holland.
Right. No, that doesn't ring a bell with me. And what period are we talking about? Pre-1880s?
Oh, no. I'm talking about not more than 50 years ago, possibly less.
Right. No, not to my knowledge. That doesn't, the name Nicholas doesn't appear.
Yeah, I'm not certain of the Nicholas, but if you would have known it, because he was a well-known oboist.
Oh, no. No, I remember when my mother was alive, she found the name Dehaan in some, I can't remember the situation, but the person with the name Dehaan was quite high status in her mind, and she got very excited that she might be related to somebody, you know, with some standing in the world. But unfortunately, the Dehaan family that are part of my family tree were really humble people, very poor people, really. It struck me when I looked at this photograph how beautifully dressed they are. But you know, as we know with the Jewish culture, probably Rose's parents would have saved from her birth for that day, and I suspect some of the groom's accessories might have been secondhand or even borrowed from the photographer. So I know that they were very poor people, and my mother was bitterly disappointed. She wrote to this person and got a very sniffy reply. She's very disappointed to find that she wasn't high status Dehaan. And there's various spellings of that name as well, as you probably know. In some situations it's spelt as one word, in situations it's spelt as 2 words. And the friend that was looking at my family tree found it's spelt DEHAAS on one entry. So mistakes are made. There is somebody on my tree that always referred to himself as Dehaan, which is a bit new as well. I think it's because it sounded more refined, more English. Dehaan sounds quite posh, doesn't it? Dehaan. So there's all different ways and means and spellings and interpretations and pronunciations of the name. You probably know more than me about it. But it's only DEHAAN as far as
that's the spelling. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Hello, can I have a word?
Yes, do.
Unmute yourself, please.
I have, otherwise you couldn't have heard me. You mentioned de Haan and de Haas, H-A-A-S. Well, a Haas in Dutch is a hare. So these are completely different names to any Dutchman. It is not necessarily a misspelling. It's probably correct.
I think the friend that was doing my tree found several entries with the correct spelling, and then the same people were listed somewhere else, and it really did just look like a misspelling, you know, by the person taking down the details. I don't think it was anything significant, but she noticed that somebody had put an S instead of an N. But it was definitely the same people that were, I think it was a census entry.
Well, he speaks to Dutchman. I have a different opinion, but you may well be right, because spellings for outsiders, I mean non-Dutchmen, in Dutch is very difficult, I would imagine. But
yeah.
Here is my reflection.
Okay, thank you.
For what it is worth.
Okay, can we turn to Doreen for the next question?
Yeah, hi everybody. You must excuse me because I did miss part of your talk, so I'm really sorry that I didn't hear it all. But I must tell you that de Haas and de Haan are two different families in Victorian England. So it's possible it was not a mistake, and that we're talking about two different spellings here, two different families. Also, because I'm referring to my own books now, I have an entry of a de Haan marriage that they subscribed to a marriage portion society where people who were elected, if they were lucky, got a sum of money. So these particular de Haans in Victorian England were not of great wealth because they applied to the marriage portion society and they were successful. That's all I wanted to say. But just one other thing. At the very beginning, you mentioned that Rose was down as a cigarette maker and her father was a cigar maker. Could she not have worked for him?
I don't think he was in a position. He was I'm sure he was an employee. So I don't think it would
just occurred to me that perhaps she worked for him. It's just a possibility.
Well, I don't know. I can't imagine that really from the background that they had.
Okay, just a thought.
As an employee, but thank you for the thought.
No, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Doreen. I think next question is from Rachel de Haan. Let me just unmute you. Hang on, Rachel.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Ruth, thoroughly enjoyed your talk, and I feel sure that it could well be that your forebears, you know, have some relationship with my husband's forebears. Certainly my father, who was born in 1907, could have been a cousin to Reuben. Certainly, as so many of his family actually worked in the same cigarette factories in the East End. They lived in Whitechapel. All those streets you mentioned are common to my husband's family at that time. Though the first de Haans of his line actually came to this country, we think, in 1855-56, because prior to that, children before in Amsterdam, and then the first child born here in London was 1856. But nevertheless, certainly there could, but there were so many de Haans in the East End at that time that it could well be that there is some relationship there. But we'll be in touch.
Excellent. I'm excited.
Okay. Thank you for that. Anita, did you have a question?
Yeah, just the adoption. Was it an informal adoption or was it a legal adoption of the baby?
It was informal to start with, but very quickly it was made official. I've seen the documents.
Right. Okay.
Because it was, Becky wanted it official to safeguard everyone's interests, especially hers. She was very fearful that the baby would be taken away from her at some point. So it was made official very quickly.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Any other questions? Don't see any hands. Great. I think thank you for answering all of our questions, Ruth, and thank you again for the talk. Let me unmute Ray, and perhaps he can give some of his thanks too. Let me just unmute you, Ray. There we go.
Thank you. Thanks, Lee. Yes, what can one say? A great gift for Hanukkah, I think. Fill up the stocking there. Excellent book by the sound of it. I'd like to just mention the Wellcome Foundation. Did you trawl through their archives, or are some of those archives that were burnt, missing, gone? Are they from the Wellcome Foundation about the hospital?
No, they were from, I went to Bart's NHS Trust archive.
Oh, you said, yes, sorry.
Yeah, the Wellcome Trust was mentioned to me, but I found everything I wanted in the Bart's NHS Trust, which is that, I mean, it's the researchers use that on Call the Midwife, and the human stories just leap off the page. It was a fantastic experience. It's probably the turning point for me, actually, looking at that archive and seeing, you know, those names and how women with the same condition, the outcomes for them and what the treatments were. It was absolutely fascinating. I spent 2 days there, and it's very powerful, very moving to see, you know, the fatal outcomes and the notes that were written.
Right, thanks. Next.
Okay, so if we could give one final round of applause for Ruth, whether you're muted or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
If you're interested in the book, if anyone wants signed copies, they can email me, but otherwise Amazon, somebody's already given me a message that they've ordered it on the book depository to go to Israel. So that's a good one. Don't charge for shipping.